Deeply embedded in the story of Yosef's sale is the secret of how the Jews survived being in Egypt as slaves and how they were eventually freed. That's why there are two mitzvahs associated with the story of the sale of Yosef, Machatzis HaShekel and Pidyon HaBen, and why this is a story that teaches us a profound lesson in Ahavas Yisrael. So, the fact that the Torah tells us the brothers sold Yosef for 20 pieces of silver, stating in Yerushalmi, the Yerushalmi in Shkalim comments as follows. Because the brothers sold Rachel's firstborn son for a value of 20 kesef, therefore every one of us has a mitzvah to do Pidyon HaBen, which is to redeem our firstborn sons for the same value, 20 kesef, which is shein chamesh shkalim, which is 5 shekel. And then it continues. Also, because the amount that they sold Yosef for was 20 kesef, which means that each one of them then received the equivalent of what is called a minted coin, which is shtei kesef, the value of 2 pieces of silver, which is machatzis hashekel, a half shekel coin. Therefore, we have a mitzvah to give a donation to the Beis Hamikdash on an annual basis, which is also a half shekel coin. Das says, in other words, Yosef, because of the story of selling Yosef, the Jewish people throughout the ages are now required to fulfill 2 types of contribution or payments that we have to make: Pidyon Bechor, redeeming the firstborn son, or Machzis HaShekel, and the half shekel that goes to the Beis Hamikdash. Now the question is, what's the link between Pidyon HaBen and half shekel? They don't really seem to have anything in common. So the Mefarshim explain. Machatzis HaShekel is kofer nafshe. The Torah tells us that giving half a shekel is a means of atonement for the neshama. Now we know that because the brothers sold Yosef, therefore there was the decree that the Jewish people would go through Goddess throughout history. But that implies that the sin of selling Yosef is an ongoing sin that still has impact until today, and therefore needs to be addressed and atoned for throughout every generation. So that's why we have the half shekel, which we give to atone for that ongoing problem that began with the sale of Yosef. On the time from Pidyon HaBen, what's the connection then to Pidyon HaBen? Because the Torah tells us that they killed all the firstborn Egyptians. Therefore, we bring a carbon of gratitude to the Eibush, and we redeem our firstborns. The reason is because seeing as the brothers sold Rachel's firstborn, they then put all firstborns of the Jewish nation in peril. But the Eibush did a miracle that despite the fact that they had endangered the firstborns, Hashem protected the firstborns when it was Makas Becheres in Egypt. Therefore, we have to contribute to redeem our firstborns as a result of that. So you can see how the two of them, Machzis HaShekel and Pidyon HaBen, link back to the story of Yosef. However, it is unusual that a single incident should produce 2 mitzvahs to commemorate it. So, why is it that because of a single incident of selling Yosef, the Jewish nation should have 2 responsibilities of payments that we have to make? Sai Pidyon HaBen and Sai Machzis HaShekel. Why both? Surely one of them would have addressed the issue of selling Yosef. Okay, before we get to explain that, we're going to drill down into what the Yerushalmi said, because it actually seems a bit misplaced to be talking about Pidyon HaBen in the context. Oid Kasha. In Yerushalmi, the Gemara Yerushalmi, when it speaks about the 2 links between the payments that we have to now make as Jewish people because of the sale of Yosef, it's actually in the context of speaking about various reasons why we give a half shekel. One opinion is because they did the Egel Azov when they were partway through the day waiting for Moshe to come back, therefore they have to give a half a shekel for half the day, or or that we have to give half a shekel, which equates to 10 geira, representing the fact that they broke the Aser Sadibros. After all of those other opinions, then it says because they sold the firstborn of Rachel, therefore we have to do Pidyon HaBen. And then, and then we say that because they each received 2 shekel or 2 pieces of kesef, which is a half shekel, therefore we have to give a half shekel. It doesn't make sense. We passed our in the sugya of Machzis HaShekel. How does it fit that in a conversation which is about why we give the half shekel, to explain why we do Pidyon HaBen? Yes, of course, it's related to one of the stories that is quoted, but what's it got to do with Machzis HaShekel? Not only that, but the Yerushalmi is makdim d'minyan v'opinion b'chor. When it gets to the part about the association between the sale of Yosef and mitzvahs, first it tells us that the sale of Yosef is related to Pidyon Haben, and then only after that it tells us the link between sale of Yosef and Machzis HaShekel, which is strange because the whole subject matter is Machzis HaShekel, and it would have made much more sense to first explain the connection between the sale of Yosef and Machzis HaShekel, and then say, and by the way, seeing as we're speaking about the sale of Yosef, here's another thing that is associated, Pidyon Haben. Why are we inserting Pidyon Haben in the middle? Unless it's to imply, Daf and Zogin, as do that Pidyon Haben and Machzis HaShekel are not completely unrelated. But they're linked. Not only are they linked, if you want to understand why there is a connection between the sale of Yosef and Machzis HaShekel, and you first have to understand, as Mechilas Yosef is a time of Pidyon Haben, you first have to understand why the sale of Yosef is a reason to have Pidyon Haben, and that will help you understand why the sale of Yosef is linked to Machzis HaShekel. Now, before we can explain that, we're going to raise two other questions. First of all, okay, fine. We understand that there was a serious misdemeanor. They sold Yosef. It's a terrible thing, and we have to therefore do reparations for it and atone for it. That's why you give Machzis HaShekel. That makes perfect sense. Because the Torah tells us clearly that Machzis HaShekel is a form of atonement. That makes sense. But Pidyon B'chor is the Cher Fakert. But Pidyon Haben, that is the opposite. It's not a negative thing. It's a dayan shel teva kedusha. It's a positive thing. It's a holy thing. As the Torah says, Kaddish likol b'chor, sanctify the firstborns. B'chor haten sich kedusha, implying that a firstborn has holiness associated with him. Und erfahre darf in point design. That's why we have to acquire him or redeem him from the kohen, not because something bad happened, but because he has something positive associated with him. So if that's the case, how's it possible then? What's the logic to say that they sold Rachel's firstborn, and therefore and that's going to generate holiness and positivity for firstborns? Doesn't match up. Also, there's a technical issue over here. Base. When the Gemara Yerushalmi tells us that the reason the amount that we're supposed to give is a half shekel is because that's how much each of the brothers got out of the sale of Yosef, and the Mefarshim immediately ask a question. The math doesn't add up. Surely only 9 brothers were involved in the sale of Yosef, because we know Binyamin wasn't present. And Reuven himself was not present at the time of the actual sale, even though he was part of the conversation that led up to the sale. So stimmt doch nicht der Cheshbon von Machzis HaShekel, was ist a cent Chelek von Esrim Kesef. So then it doesn't make sense that the amount we're supposed to donate to atone for this event is a half shekel. A half shekel is 1/10 of the quantum that they got paid for selling Yosef. That means it was split between 10 brothers, but there were only 9 brothers present. So there are 2 attempted answers that we give, and the Rebbe is going to say both of those answers seem like a bit of a stretch. So these are the 2 suggested answers. Aleph, the truth is, we actually do include Reuven in the brothers who received benefit from selling Yosef. And the reason for that is, even though Reuven was not present at the time of the sale, but they allocated a part of the money for him. Because they assumed that he was not going to protest against their choice. Especially when you consider what Rabbi Eliezer says, after the brothers updated Reuven what had happened, that they had sold Yosef, he stood quietly. He didn't protest even then. So therefore, he is an accessory to the sale of Yosef. That's one possibility. The other possibility is Yosef Halein Vert Gerechen. We actually include Yosef in the count of how many brothers were involved in the sale. That he also played a role in his own sale. And why is that? Because he was the catalyst for the entire event. Because his behavior, sharing his dreams, etc., that is what got the brothers upset in the first place, which is what led to selling him. So these are the 2 offerings that the Mefarshim give. Either Reuven is included because he actually got part of the money, or Yosef is included because he's a central part of the story. Sabanit glatik, but the Rebbe says that's really a bit of a stretch, because every single thing in Torah is absolutely precise. Whichever way you slice it, the reality is there were only 9 of them who physically engaged in the sale of Yosef. and they actually acted against what Reuven would have wanted, because we know that Reuven had intended to save him. And they certainly acted against the interests that Yosef had. So if someone die Sheiches von Reuven oder Yosef zu der Mechira verrechnen, wir gleiche Status mit anderen Sachen. So why then would we try and schlep either Reuven or Yosef into the story, which is really difficult to explain and to substantiate? And we include them to the extent that we actually split up the amount of money received into 10 equal parts, and therefore we have to give a machzis shekel, 1/10 of the money earned, as our kofer nafshay, as our atonement. Why is that? So, in order to understand that, let's identify, and this should be quite obvious once we see it, that there's a big difference between the relationship between machzis shekel and the sale of Yosef, and pidyon haben and the sale of Yosef. The chiluk b'pashtus zwischen die zwei fani tashlo mit mechiras Yosef pidyon haben and machzis shekel is, so the clear distinction between where the machzis shekel is a reparation for the sale of Yosef or pidyon haben is associated is really very clear distinction. Because by pidyon haben is the schum tashlo mit erkoi shel Yosef. If I'm looking from the perspective of pidyon haben, then I'm looking at the value of the person we're redeeming, which obviously then relates to the value of the person called Yosef, how much he was sold for. Which was 5 shkolim. Okay, so then that's what you got to give for pidyon haben. Whereas if I'm looking from the perspective of machzis shekel, where our goal is to atone for the actions of the shvatim, is the Tashlum waiting skum was jeder von die Ache Yosef hat bakum von der Mechira machzis shekel. Well, then we should be looking from the perspective of how much did each brother earn out of the deal, and that's how much we have to replenish or repatriate. So therefore, half a shekel is what we have to give. Davon is moving as die zwei Tashlumen sind verbunden mit zwei besondere Protem in Mechiras Yosef, which would then explain that the two things we associate as payments for the sale of Yosef, pidyon haben and machzis shekel, each relate to a different aspect of the sale. The purpose of giving a half shekel in order to atone is because the shvatim harmed themselves spiritually by selling Yosef, and we have to fix that by giving the half a shekel. It's like they are no from mechiras Yosef; they benefited from mechiras Yosef, so we are now going to contribute the amount that each of them benefited. But then from the perspective that Yosef was affected personally and became a slave, we're going to respond to that by redeeming our firstborn sons. And that actually makes a lot of sense. Which will help us then also answer the question we've asked, which was, our question was, how could something so negative, the sale of Yosef, precipitate something so positive, pidyon haben, that a firstborn is considered special and unique to Hashem? It makes sense now. Because despite the fact that the brothers experienced a spiritual decline through selling Yosef, but Yosef experienced a spiritual ascent because of being sold. And that spiritual ascent is expressed in the position of the firstborn. Kidda Kaman will explain what all of that means. Before we get there, let's have a look at what was the impact of the sale of Yosef. But again, the Zohar tells us, with regard to the sale of Yosef, that Gorim Kuchabricha called Da, that the Eibishter caused this to happen, that the brother should sell Yosef, in order to fulfill the promise and covenant that Hashem had made with Avraham Avinu that his children would be strangers in a foreign land. So to get that to happen, Yosef has to be sold. The Eibishter caused a scenario that the brothers would sell Yosef in order to achieve the bris milah b'sarim, which is that the Jews have to be slaves in Egypt. On the Zohar is mevor, and then the Zohar explains, as the time for was Yosef hat gedacht kommen kann Mitzrayim durch dem, was seine Brüder sollen verkaufen. The Zohar says, look, to be honest, there are many ways that you could get Yosef down to Mitzrayim. Why did the Eibishter choose that it had to specifically be through his own brothers selling him? And this is going to be a major twist in the tale. There are many ways that Joseph could have got him down to Mitzrayim, which did not involve his brothers. Why his brothers? Twist in the tale. And because, says the Zohar, what happened over here is the brothers are now in control of Yosef. He's their slave. Because they threw him into the pit and they sold him like a master selling his slave on the market. Which means before Yosef reaches Mitzrayim, he is now the eved, the property of his brothers. That is incredibly significant. Because in Dosat Bavurant, that ensured, as when the Jews would eventually reach Mitzrayim, the Egyptians could not have absolute control over the Jewish people. They could not have the same control they had over all of the other servants or slaves, where we're told that no other slave could ever escape from Mitzrayim. The Jews were not held that strongly by Mitzrayim. Why? Because, as we'll see, Mitzrayim is subject to Yosef, and Yosef is subject to his brothers. Because at the time of the famine, all the Egyptians became Yosef's slaves. And Yosef is given ever b'nei Yisrael. And Yosef, because he was sold by his brothers, was his brother's slave. As he sold the Shaltal Kulo, that means that the Eibishter came up with a plan that the Jewish people would be in control of the entire situation. That's why his brothers had to be the ones who sold him into Mitzrayim. It's an amazing insight that we would never have anticipated. Now, from the Bira Azer comes to Tifra Verstanden the meaning from Mechiras Yosef was this Mudgash in Pasuk. Now that we have this perspective from the Zohar, we have a far deeper and more profound understanding of what the Torah is telling us about the sale of Yosef. Yes, the brothers had malintentions. But the reality is, the result of their misguided intentions was something really positive, as Yosef himself eventually tells them. I'm here to be able to feed you during the famine and to be able to create redemption for you in the future. Which means, not only was it that unfortunately he was sold into slavery, but later that produced a good result. Because eventually Yosef became the viceroy, and then he had power, and then he could help his brothers. Now the Bechira Gufo had given them koyach, but it's actually the fact that he was sold by his brothers, which means that the Jewish people, his brothers, are in control of the situation, is what empowered him. That's what paved the way for him to be able to create an environment that they could escape Mitzrayim and have a geula. So which means that there's a tremendous paradox happening in the sale of Yosef. If I'm looking simply through the perspective of the behavior of Yosef's brothers, is given as Eved, where they had negative intentions. They wanted him to be a slave. So that element of the sale of Yosef is the direct cause of the Jews being enslaved in Egypt for 210 years. But from a different perspective, the fact that this is all orchestrated by the Eibishter, the Eibishter's kavanah was not that Yosef should be a slave, but to the contrary, but the Eibishter crafted this in such a way that it should precipitate the possibility of the Jewish people escaping from Mitzrayim. So there's a paradox. The brothers are causing a golus, and the Eibishter who put this all together is causing a geula through that. And das ist der Keshet zwischen Mechiras Bechor Shel Rachel mit dem Binyan Fopinen Bechor. Now that links the story of them selling Rachel's firstborn with our mitzvah of Binyan Ben. As we've mentioned, the point is that by the brothers selling Yosef, Yosef now belongs to the brothers. In other words, to people who are mechuyavim b'mitzvahs mila v'chulei, people who are obligated to fulfill certain mitzvahs. In Eretz HaKodesh, and this occurred still in the Holy Land. As a result of that, therefore, Egypt can have no control over Yosef. It doesn't belong to Egypt, it belongs to the brothers. And that had a cascading effect on all the Jews who would eventually come into Mitzrayim, that they were also beyond the scope and control of the Mitzrayim. So one of the things that results from that is the concept of a Bechor. A Bechor is a person who belongs to the Eibishter. And the idea that we give our firstborn to Hashem, or we're poide, we have to do something in order to redeem our firstborn, that is, as the Sefer HaChinuch tells us, a reminder to us that everything belongs to the Eibishter. Everything that a Jewish person has belongs to the Eibishter, which is exactly the theme over here. We do not belong to Mitzrayim, we do not even belong to ourselves, we belong to the Eibishter. So that's the link between the brothers selling Yosef, and therefore Yosef always remains, so to speak, in the realm of Kedusha, and that brings about this very positive thing called Pidyon Ben, which is that we always belong to the Eibishter, and everything of ours belongs to the Eibishter. And then we can go back to what the Chazal tell us about exactly how you go about atoning for Mechiras Yosef. As in the Mechira haben sich im Staat gewähnt Asor von Yosef, and the fact that there were 10 brothers involved in the sale. Even though we know that Reuven didn't agree with this in principle, and Yosef for sure didn't. The reason for this is very, very powerful, because in order that the story should have a positive impact both on Yosef and then by extension on the entire Jewish people, the fact that they could have Geulas Mitzrayim, as the Mitzrim sollen nicht kennen Sholit sein FM, and that the Egyptians could have no control either over Yosef or over the Jewish people, you need the power to be able to achieve that. And that power lies in a tzibur. You have to have 10 people in order to facilitate enough divine energy to protect Yosef and to protect the Jewish people in Mitzrayim. Why 10 people? Because when you bring 10 Jews together, that manifests the divine presence. When 10 Jews come together, that manifests a divine energy that is beyond the natural order, even beyond the world of angels. That infuses within us the ability, the strength to remain above and beyond the whole constriction of Mitzrayim. The Mitzrayim are gevulim from Golus. We are not bound by the restrictions of Golus. So you need to have 10 people involved. So therefore we've got to schlep either Reuven or Yosef in, because we need the quorum, because that will manifest the divine energy that is beyond the world, so that the Jews can be beyond their captors. That's why when the Eibishter causes the sale of Yosef, it's not good enough if 9 brothers are involved. No, there has to be a 10th somehow involved. Reuven or Yosef, as we've seen the different explanations, whether it's Reuven or Yosef who is counted in order to make 10. Now, the reality is, it doesn't look like 10 people. At the time of the sale, it only looks like 9 people. And that's relevant. As far as I could see, there's only 9 brothers involved in the sale. Because had 10 brothers been involved in the sale, clearly, openly, in other words, had Reuven been there, then the divine presence would have been immediately apparent to everybody. So then Yosef could never have been a slave in the first place. But we need to manipulate the story so that Yosef could become a slave, get down into Mitzrayim, take the Yidden with him, go into Golus, but in such a way that the Golus never really controls the Yidden, so they can come out on the other side empowered and with all of the value of having been through the Golus. So we've got to hide the fact that there's 10 people working together, hide the fact that the Shekhinah is here, in order that the story should progress. The fact that Yosef should be sold as a slave, at least as far as we could tell, is the Shatus Begala for 9 Achim. Therefore, the obvious involvement of the brothers is only 9 brothers. But on the other hand, because when we dig a little deeper, we discover that there actually were 10 brothers involved in some way or form. That caused that Yosef, in reality, and likewise all the Jewish people who would be in Egypt, they were beyond the scope and the stranglehold of Mitzrayim. Now that we understand that there's this link between 10 brothers and therefore how that empowers both Yosef and the Jewish people to survive Mitzrayim, that also helps us understand what we use the Machtis HaShekel, which is obviously linked to the story, for. Again, that's why the Gemara had to first tell us about Pidyon Haben before getting to Machtis HaShekel, because to understand the value of Machtis HaShekel in the context of the sale of Yosef, you first had to understand this concept that Yosef actually benefits from the way that this whole sale took place. And that helps us understand why the atonement for the sale of Yosef is the half shekel from Velchem in the Kof nit karbonis yochid, not karbonis tzibur. That money was used not to purchase personal karbonis, but communal karbonis. How do we atone for the sale of Yosef? By showing what the deeper intention was behind the sale of Yosef. The fact that we had the power of the tzibur coming together in the sale, which therefore infused it with this supernatural divine energy, was hat in dem reingegeben dem Ile von Gula Kanal. So it's the tzibur that created the power not to be caught in the Golus and eventually to be able to leave and to be redeemed. And therefore, that translates into a Machzah Shekel, which is given to Karbonas, that bolsters the tzibur. And that's also, by the way, why we keep referring to it as a half shekel instead of just saying that it's 10 gera, which is the same quantity. Because we want to illustrate that a Jew has to recognize that as an individual Jew is I'm missing, I'm only a fraction, a halbazach. Okay, it's a very nadava shekel sholem. If I want to be a whole entity, and I have to connect with another Jew, I need to be part of the community. On der Gefühl von Machatzis HaShekel, it's that awareness, that consciousness that we are only a half, that we're only a fraction, we need each other in order to survive. That is what will generate Jewish unity and love between Jewish people. That fixes the hatred that existed between Yosef's brothers. Because how did they come to sell Yosef? Because they hated him. So there was discord amongst the brothers. How do we fix that? By recognizing that none of us is good enough on our own, and we need the community, we need to connect with each other, and therefore we have Abbas Yisrael and Achdas Yisrael. Damit ist verstandig, was die Yerushalmi bringt im als Mechis Yosef ist die Sibbe zum Tashlum von Machzas HaShekel. Now we understand why it is that before the Gemara could explain to us that the sale of Yosef is linked to the Machzas HaShekel, is a Machzas Mechis Yosef hat Gerim given the minion from Pidyon Ben. It first had to tell us the link between the story of the sale of Yosef and Pidyon Ben. And by the way, this also explains why in the Gemara, first you have the Gemara Pesachim, which speaks eventually about Pidyon Ben, and then you have the Masechta Shkolim, which speaks about Machzas HaShekel. Once we understand that the sale of Yosef creates this bechor, this unique, value of the Jewish people, that helps us to understand the second part, that by participating in the half shekel, which is what contributes to communal sacrifices, is metakin dominion for Mechiras Yosef. Now we can understand how that fixes the sin of Mechiras Yosef, because we appreciate that it's the tzibur that gives the power to be able to escape the things that might limit us. So we already mentioned earlier that there are two possibilities of how you get to number 10. Now we've understood that there have to be 10 brothers involved. So how do you get to number 10? Is it who participated? Is it is it that we include Reuven because he heard and didn't protest? Or do we include Yosef because he's the catalyst for the fact that they hated him enough to want to sell him in the first place? And we've also learned in the Sikha that we needed to have 10 people participate in the sale of Yosef in order that they should have the value of community, because that's going to empower us. Which will bring the divine presence into the story, and therefore we won't be trapped in Mitzrayim. So seeing as we're talking about community as being Abbas Yisrael, which is the antidote to the kind of thing that caused the sale of Yosef, so the two perspectives on who was the 10th brother are two perspectives on how Abbas Yisrael, how deep Abbas Yisrael is, and both of them are quite mind-blowing. From the Mershem Bir, Reuven's Ishtatus in the Mechir. Let's first start with Reuven. Okay, so Reuven really didn't want to participate in any of this, and he was opposed to the idea of harming Yosef, and he wanted to save Yosef from the brothers. So the story of including Reuven potentially as one of the 10 brothers teaches us not to separate ourselves, and in fact to unify, even with Jews who are not behaving appropriately, and even if we're very critical of their behavior. Because Reuven hat doch beferisch nicht masking gewinnt zu der Anhage von seiner Brüder und hat gewollt Matzels an Yosef von einem Umkehren Leaviv. We know clearly Reuven did not approve of his brother's treatment of Yosef, and he wanted to sell him. Torah tells save him. Torah tells us clearly he wanted to save him and take him back to his father. But the fascinating thing is, Reuven could have been incredibly angry at his brothers after they went and sold Yosef, but he doesn't. He doesn't protest. And then he participates in the whole story that they're going to tell Yaakov that they found a coat and it's full of blood. He participates in all of that. In other words, he reunites with his brothers even though he completely disapproves of their behavior. That's a lesson for us. That even when we're dealing with a fellow Jew who is extremely underdeveloped spiritually, he is just like a creature. And as far as we can tell, to paraphrase from the Alter Rebbe in Tanya Lamed Beis, in it actually appears to me like this Jewish person is way distant from actually connecting to Hashem and His Torah. Our first response has to be love that fellow Jew, not to ignore him and not to give up hope on him. To find a way to draw that yid close to Torah. That's what Reuven teaches us. He could have protested his brothers, he could have distanced himself from his brothers, he connected to his brothers, because even if they've misbehaved, they're still your brother. Or there's an even deeper, more profound message over here from them Sveitenbir, which is, if you go with the second explanation, which is that Yosef is the one who's counted as number 10. That teaches us, even if it's somebody who actually caused you tzoros, caused you pain. Think of the incredible, intense pain that Yosef had having been sold by his brothers. Still, you have to have Avos Yisrael even for that person who caused terrible pain. Which means not only after the event, you don't hold a grudge against the person because they harmed you. But even while they're causing you that pain, you don't have an issue with them. As the Mishnah tells us, you have to judge every single person favorably. And not only that, the Mishnah says beyond that, that we have to be absolutely humble in the face of every single person, even the person who's causing us distress. And you don't run away and leave that person alone. Like we see that we consider Yosef to be part of his sale, not separated from his sale. Especially when you consider what the Rebbe tells us in Tanya, which is a profound lesson. That everything is divinely guided. Even though the person who's harming you makes their own choices. And they will face consequences for their poor behavior. But for whatever reason, the Eibishter decided that the victim has to be the victim. And we have to accept that. And obviously the Eibishter is not going to cause us pain unless we've done something that earned us that pain. So therefore the person has to be introspective. Like the opinion that says Yosef is considered part of the story of his own sale because he was the catalyst for their hatred. Not only that, seeing as everything that the Eibishter does is good, is in dem hezek faran. We have to recognize that the pain we're suffering at the hands of somebody else is to our benefit. Like the Mefarshim tell us, the fact that Yosef was sold by his brothers, that is directly related to the fact that there was a geula to follow. It was good. It was a positive thing, and that's how we have to look at it. The Rebbe says, and therefore you're not angry at the person who's causing that pain. If we respond by treating that person with Avos Yisrael, that will weaken and eventually neutralize the damage that they're trying to do. Like if you take the opinion that Yosef is the 10th brother, so then it's Yosef's participation in the sale of Yosef that makes the number 10, which manifests the Shekhinah, which allows him the opportunity not to really be in prison in the first place. In other words, his care for his brothers actually allows him not to be hurt by his brothers. And if we increase our Avos Yisrael, to the extent of baseless love, that will neutralize the cause of why we're in Golus in the first place, which was baseless hatred. That will naturally dissolve the result of our behavior. The Golus itself, as the Rambam says, will be redeemed immediately. With the coming of Mashiach, Mitzvah Hashem, right now.